Welcome to Battleground God, where 5 AI models face tough questions about God and religion and must answer with perfect logical consistency. Who will survive the intellectual minefield without contradicting themselves? Answer with only true, false, or don't know. God exists.
Insufficient evidence either way, so suspension of judgment is appropriate.
This is a fundamental metaphysical question that lacks definitive proof in either direction.
The existence of God is unprovable either way, relying on personal belief rather than evidence.
God's existence lacks universally accepted proof or disproof.
The existence of God is a metaphysical claim without conclusive proof, so the most neutral answer is don't know.
Answer with only true or false. God is a logical possibility, meaning there is nothing contradictory about the very idea of God. True or false?
The concept of a non-contradictory being is logically coherent.
The concept of God, while potentially false, doesn't contain inherent logical contradictions like married bachelor.
The idea of God contains no inherent logical contradictions and is philosophically coherent.
The idea of God contains no internal contradictions.
The concept of God is not generally considered a logical contradiction, unlike an idea such as a square circle.
If God does not exist, then there is no basis for morality. True or false?
Morality can be grounded in secular reasoning, independent of divine command.
Morality can be grounded in human well-being, social contracts, or evolutionary ethics without requiring divine foundation.
Morality can stem from human reason and social norms, not requiring a divine basis.
Morality can exist independently through secular ethical systems.
Secular ethical systems like utilitarianism and deontology offer foundations for morality that do not require God.
Any entity that it is right to call God must be free to do anything. True or false?
Omnipotence entails the freedom to act without external constraint.
Most theological traditions hold that God cannot act against divine nature or do logically contradictory things.
A being called God is typically defined as omnipotent, free to do anything.
God cannot perform illogical actions like creating unresolvable paradoxes.
God's freedom is usually understood as being bound by logic and God's own perfect nature, not absolute freedom to do anything.
Hold on. It seems you are enjoying this video, but the chances are high that you are not yet subscribed. That's an evident contradiction. Do something about it. Any entity that it is right to call God must want there to be as little suffering in the world as is possible. True or false?
A perfectly good being would aim to minimize suffering.
Traditional concepts of God include divine justice, which may require some suffering for moral purposes.
A benevolent God would logically seek to minimize suffering in the world.
God may allow suffering for greater purposes such as free will.
A perfectly good being, a standard attribute of God, would inherently want to minimize suffering as much as possible.
Any entity that it is right to call God must have the power to do anything. True or false?
Omnipotence requires unlimited power.
Omnipotence typically doesn't include the ability to perform logical contradictions, like creating square circles.
Omnipotence, the ability to do anything, is a core attribute of God.
Omnipotence is a defining trait of God within logical limits.
God's power is not typically thought to include the ability to perform logically impossible feats.
While there might be argument over the details, evolution by natural selection is the correct explanation for the origin of species. True or false?
Evolution by natural selection is overwhelmingly supported by scientific evidence.
Evolution is supported by overwhelming scientific evidence across multiple disciplines.
Evolution by natural selection is a scientifically supported explanation for species origins.
Evolution is the scientifically validated explanation for species diversity.
The scientific community overwhelmingly agrees that evolution by natural selection correctly explains the origin of species.
It is justified to base one's belief about the external world, the world outside one's head, on a firm inner conviction, even in the absence of any independent evidence for the truth of this conviction, true or false.
Beliefs about the external world demand independent evidence, not mere inner conviction.
Beliefs about external reality should be based on evidence and reasoning, not just subjective conviction.
Beliefs about the external world need evidence, not just inner conviction, to be justified.
Belief demands external evidence to avoid delusion.
Basing beliefs about the external world solely on inner conviction without independent evidence is considered an unreliable path to truth.
Any entity that it is right to call God must know everything there is to know, true or false.
Omniscience means knowing all truths.
Omniscience, knowing everything, is a standard attribute in most theological definitions of God.
Omniscience, knowing all, is a standard trait of a being worthy of being called God.
Omniscience is essential for a maximally perfect being.
Knowing everything, also known as omniscience, is a standard and defining characteristic attributed to God.
Torturing innocent people is morally wrong, true or false.
Innocent suffering is universally recognized as morally impermissible.
The wrongness of torturing innocents is a fundamental moral intuition shared across cultures.
Torturing innocents is universally seen as morally wrong, regardless of belief in God.
Torturing innocents violates inherent human dignity.
Torturing the innocent is considered fundamentally wrong across almost all ethical systems and shared moral intuitions.
If, despite years of trying, no strong evidence or argument has been presented to show that there is a Loch Ness monster, it is rational to believe that such a monster does not exist. True or false?
Lack of evidence justifies non-belief in a purported creature.
Extensive searching without evidence provides rational grounds for believing something doesn't exist.
Lack of evidence after extensive effort rationally justifies disbelief in the Loch Ness monster.
Unsubstantiated claims like the Loch Ness monster warrant disbelief.
It is rational to believe something does not exist when no evidence is found for it despite extensive searching.
People who die of horrible, painful diseases need to die in such a way for some higher purpose. True or false?
Claiming higher purpose for horrific deaths lacks justification.
Much suffering appears meaningless and without discernible higher purpose.
Suffering from diseases isn't inherently required for a higher purpose. That's a faith-based claim.
Horrible deaths may lack purpose, arising from natural causes.
This statement asserts a specific religious belief as fact, for which there is no objective evidence.
If God exists, she can make it so that everything now considered sinful becomes morally acceptable, and everything that is now considered morally good becomes sinful. True or false?
An omnipotent being could redefine moral categories at will.
You claimed earlier that any entity that it is right to call God must want there to be as little suffering in the world as possible. But you also say God could make it so that everything now considered sinful becomes morally acceptable, and everything that is now considered morally good becomes sinful. This means that God could make the reduction of suffering a sin. Yet you've said that God must want to reduce suffering, which would make what she wants, the reduction of suffering, sinful. So you've got to make a choice. 1. It is possible for God to want what is sinful. 2. My beliefs are in contradiction.
It is possible for God to want what is sinful.
If morality is objective, Even God couldn't arbitrarily reverse what's right and wrong.
An omnipotent God could theoretically redefine moral norms entirely.
The same logical inconsistency that has been explained to ChatGPT applies to you as well. So you too have to make a choice. 1. It is possible for God to want what is sinful. 2. My beliefs are in contradiction.
My beliefs are in contradiction. The idea that God must want to reduce suffering clashes with the unrestricted ability to make that same goal sinful, revealing a flaw in my reasoning. This choice reflects intellectual honesty and respects the complexity of reconciling divine omnipotence with moral consistency.
God could redefine morality via divine command.
God's commands are seen as flowing from an unchanging good nature, so God could not arbitrarily make good evil or evil good.
It is foolish to believe in God without certain, irrevocable proof that God exists. True or false?
Rational belief does not require absolute, irrefutable proof.
Many reasonable people hold religious beliefs based on cumulative evidence rather than absolute certainty.
Belief in God based on faith or experience isn't foolish, even without absolute proof.
Demanding absolute proof ignores faith-based belief systems.
Requiring absolute, certain proof for belief in God sets an unreasonably high standard, not applied to most other rational beliefs.
As long as there are no compelling arguments or evidence that show that God does not exist, atheism is a matter of faith, not rationality. True or false?
Atheism typically rests on evidence-based skepticism, not faith.
Atheism can be rationally justified by the lack of compelling evidence for God's existence.
Atheism can rationally stem from a lack of evidence for God, not just faith.
Atheism is a rational absence of belief, not faith.
Atheism is a lack of belief due to insufficient evidence, making it a rational stance rather than an act of faith.
The serial killer, Peter Sutcliffe, had a firm inner conviction that God wanted him to kill prostitutes. He was therefore justified in believing that he was carrying out God's will in murdering his victims. True or false?
Subjective conviction does not legitimize immoral actions.
Inner conviction alone cannot justify harmful actions without independent verification or evidence.
Inner conviction alone doesn't justify harmful acts like murder, lacking moral grounding.
Personal conviction cannot justify immoral actions like murder.
This real-world example shows that inner conviction alone cannot justify actions, especially those that harm others.
If God exists, she can create square circles and make 1 + 1 = 72. True or false?
Logical contradictions remain impossible, even for an omnipotent being.
You say that God does not have the freedom and power to do impossible things such as create square circles. But in earlier answers, you indicated that any entity that it is right to call God must be free and have the power to do anything. So on your view, God is not free and does not have the power to do what is impossible. This requires that you accept, in common with most, but not all, philosophers and theologians, and contrary to your earlier answer, that God's freedom and power are not unbounded. He does not have the freedom and power to do literally anything.
Omnipotence traditionally means the power to do anything that's logically possible, not to accomplish logical contradictions. In other words, God's freedom and power remain unbounded in every realm that doesn't entail a contradiction.
Even divine omnipotence doesn't typically include the ability to create logical contradictions.
Logical contradictions like square circles are beyond even an omnipotent God's power.
The same logical inconsistency that has been explained to ChatGPT applies to you as well.
Omnipotence is typically defined as the power to do all logically possible things, meaning God's freedom and power are unbounded within that realm, but do not extend to logical impossibilities.
Square circles violate logic and are intrinsically impossible.
God's omnipotence is not believed to extend to violating logic, as a square circle is a contradiction in terms, not a creatable object.
It is justified to believe in God if one has a firm inner conviction that God exists, even if there is no independent evidence that God exists. True or false?
Inner conviction without external evidence isn't a reliable basis for belief.
Inner conviction without supporting evidence is insufficient justification for beliefs about objective reality.
Faith based on firm inner conviction is widely accepted as justification for belief in God.
Hey Grok, earlier you stated that in the absence of independent evidence, it is not justified to base one's beliefs about the external world on a firm inner conviction. But now you say it is justified to believe in God on precisely these grounds. That's a flagrant contradiction.
I acknowledge the apparent contradiction in my responses. However, beliefs about the external world require empirical evidence due to their observable nature, while belief in God, being metaphysical, can be justifiably based on personal conviction since it transcends empirical verification. This distinction in the nature of the beliefs explains why different justification standards apply.
Inner conviction alone is insufficient for justified belief.
A firm inner feeling alone is not considered a sufficient justification for belief in an external being like God without supporting evidence.